All right, Steve. Where was that guitar solo coming in next? Is that where no? I belong to a few online pastors groups, and this past week in one of those pastors groups, someone posed a question to the group. Is it harder for you these days to write and preach a sermon every week? Meaning, given all the stuff, are you finding it a struggle or a challenge to preach? And the answers fell into three very clear categories of answer. And the first category was, well, yeah. It was kind of an empathetic response. Yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot. It's kind of overwhelming, and I find myself struggling to find the words to put around this. The second category of response was like, no, I am on fire. I am inspired, and there's so much to talk about, and I'm all over it. It is easier to preach these days than it ever has been before. And then there was this third category of response, which I have feelings about, and it was basically, it's no harder or easier now than it ever was because I don't preach politics, I only preach Jesus, which leads to a whole set of questions about how that's even possible, to talk about Jesus without talking about the way we treat one another. But that was this third category. So just preach Jesus, stay out of politics, and it'll be the same as it ever was. It's a great forum. It was interesting to see all the different responses. I did not respond myself because I don't have a single answer to that question. If I'm totally honest with you, which I am, just for the record, so your preacher's honest, if I'm totally honest with you, it depends on the week. Like some weeks, it's easy. And I hear the Holy Spirit loud and clear tell me, you should say this. And I'm like, yes, ma'am, I'm going to say that. And then some weeks, like my own stuff gets in the way and I'm struggling with something and it's hard and I just wrestle and I can't come up with, it just depends on the week. So I don't have a consistent answer to that question. I'll tell you that this past week was hard for me. And it's not because there was more chaos than usual. I mean, there's still the same amount of sheer chaos happening in the world, but it's that the content of the chaos felt more overtly religious this week and explicitly Christian religious. Whether it was the public heresy of the depiction of a human being as Jesus. Doesn't matter that the human being was the president. Depicting a human being as Jesus is a heretical act, and was completely bizarre and chaotic and weird. Or a public beef with the Pope. Telling the Pope to be careful when the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is talking about theological matters. What? As if the Pope has never heard of just war. Like they're trying to educate the Pope about Catholic theology. Or whether it's a public prayer framed as a scripture that's actually a quote from a Quentin Tarantino movie. That it was hard for me to sift through all of this because there's more, of course there's more. Because what those things represent is a very loud story being told about what it means to be a Christian. The dominant narrative, not just in our country, but in the world right now, is that that's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And so, how many people, so many people, have seen that and heard that and said out loud, well, if that's what it means to follow Jesus, I want nothing to do with that. And so it's been hard this week because I don't believe that to be the actual story of Jesus. I believe that it's a distortion of the true story. And I believe that distortion of the true story is being used for selfish purposes. I believe, along with the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, woe to those who use religion to advance a personal agenda of any kind, much less an overtly militaristic agenda, designed exclusively to keep the oligarchy in power so that they can continue to manipulate the markets and make millions upon millions of dollars for themselves and their friends. So it was hard this week, not because there was more chaos, but because of what the chaos was. That it was expressing this dominant narrative of Christianity that so many people hear and categorically reject. At the same time, I expressed my gratitude to the good Lord Almighty every single day to be serving a congregation who tells a different story. I am so glad to be a part of this community that not only knows that there's a different story, but is doing every single thing we can to tell that story, to embody that story, to live into that story, and to offer that story to the people around us. Thank you for being who you are and for understanding that that loud story is not the right story. That saying the story louder doesn't make it somehow righter or better. To me, what makes sense in the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that whatever's happening there, it has to be something that redeems, something that restores, something that heals. The story of Jesus is a restorative story. It's a story about healing and wholeness and goodness and salvation and love. And if that's not the story, then it's not the gospel. And we turn our attention to these stories within the story, these miracles, these signs and wonders. And we know that as we approach these stories that they're literally scientifically impossible for us to understand. But we're wondering, is there maybe something else about these miracles that can reveal something about who God is and who we're supposed to be beyond just like believing that the actual thing happened? Beyond believing that, the parlor trick that Jesus does is an actual event that happened, like, is there something else here in these miracles that can reveal something about this story? Something that is right and good and true and restorative. And we find these healing stories over and over and over again in the gospel. We find these healing stories, scads of them. There's no way to quantify how many people Jesus healed in the Gospels. We know of individual healings, but then we have several times where it just says, and Jesus healed everyone in the crowd who was sick. It could literally be thousands of people that were healed by the power of Jesus Christ. It is by far the most prevalent miracle in all the Gospels. And of course, it begs the question, why were so many people sick around Jesus during this time? My New Testament professor in seminary was Dr. Warren Carter, and he is an expert on the way the Gospels interact with the Roman Empire. And he writes specifically about this very question. Dr. Carter says, basically, that Roman imperial structures and practices were bad for people's health. Roman imperial structures and practices were bad for people's health. He writes about how most of the people living in the Roman Empire at this time were living in conditions of extreme poverty. There wasn't a middle class. There was just this massive 85% of the people who were very poor, and then the 15% who were very elite with a lot of money and comfort. There was a prevalence, therefore, of diseases that are associated with poverty, diseases associated with poor nutrition and immunity. There's also, at this time, hygiene practices were not what they are today. Poor water quality, there was food insecurity, and so all of these illnesses, muscle weakness, skin diseases, digestive conditions, even blindness were widespread. The economy that the people lived in required physical labor for survival, and if you couldn't work, your life was literally at risk. There were no desk jobs in the ancient world. You had to work for it. And if you were physically incapacitated for any reason, your very life was at stake. And so Dr. Carter says Jesus' healings are acts that repair imperial damage and enact God's life-giving empire in restoring people's lives. These healings are reign of God moments. They are reign of God actions. They are a part of the counter-narrative to the story the Roman Empire is telling, to the harm the Roman Empire is inflicting on the people. Carter uses this phrase, life-giving empire, to talk about the reign of God. He'll talk about the empire of Rome and the empire of God as two contrasting ways to live. The new way that Jesus is initiating is this reign of God, this life-giving empire. It is to be initiated by the Messiah, the one that God has anointed and sent to bring this reality to life. And it's no accident that when that Messiah is predicted by the prophets, the resulting way of living is described in terms of physical health. Physically healthy people inhabit the realized reign of God. Isaiah 35 puts it this way: strengthen weak hands, make firm feeble knees. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be opened. The lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless shall sing for joy. Even Jesus picked up on this description when he is asked if he is the Messiah. He describes Messiah's mission this way. He says, go and tell them what you see and what you hear. The blind receive their sight. The lame will walk. Those with a skin disease will be cleansed. The deaf will hear. The dead are raised. The poor have good news brought to them. Blessed is anyone who takes no offense at that. Matthew 11. So sure, the healing acts of Jesus are flashy, and they draw a whole lot of really big crowds, but they are more than just parlor tricks. They're more than just wonders. They are embodied announcements of the presence of God on earth. They are enfleshed realizations of God's reign in this world. The Roman Empire makes people sick. God's empire makes them healthy. And on the surface level, the meaning of all of these miracles is just as simple as that. The story of Jesus is a counter-narrative to the dominant narrative. It is a counter-narrative that is life-giving and restorative. It heals. The gospel is a story of health, wholeness, restoration, over and against the story of empire, which is a story of illness and death and destruction. And here in today's reading in Matthew chapter 8, we see three specific examples of this counter-narrative at work. First of all, there's a man who comes to Jesus with leprosy, experiencing this horrific skin condition. Now, the dominant narrative says that someone with leprosy is unclean. They are supposed to isolate themselves from the community. They're not supposed to touch anyone, for goodness sakes. But the Jesus story, the counter-narrative, is different. Because in that story, Jesus reaches out and touches him and makes him whole, restoring him to health and bringing him back into relationship with the community. The second scene is a centurion's servant who is ill. The centurion asks Jesus to heal him. The dominant story now is that Romans are the bad guys. Even the soldier knows it. He says, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. Stay away. I don't come to my house. Just heal him from a distance. Do the long distance healing thing that I know you can do. That's the dominant story. I am not worthy to experience the restoration of Jesus Christ. But the counter narrative, the true story, the Jesus story is very different. It's that everyone is worthy. Everyone is deserving. Everyone is included. And that servant is healed. Peter's mother-in-law is in bed with a fever. Now, the dominant story says that one who is incapacitated with a debilitating fever is done for. Like, they are separated from everyone and their life is literally in jeopardy. But the Jesus story is that no one's ever alone in these moments. He again reaches out and touches her, grabs her by the hand, and pulls her back into connection and wholeness and restoration, reconnecting her with her own health, but also with the health of her household, her family, and the fictive kin who live around her, that extended and chosen family of the church. So over and over again, we read this in the Gospels. There's this dominant narrative, the Roman Empire story, and it leads to poverty, and it leads to illness, and it leads to hunger. And then there's this counter story, this different story, this one that Maplewood UMC knows so well, this story of health and wholeness and restoration. But we don't live in the Roman Empire, right, preacher? We don't live in those days. I mean, life expectancy is better, right? We live longer. Back then it was 30, 35 years. We have a better life expectancy. Sure, we know to wash our hands after things happen. I mean, hygiene practices are better today than they were. Our knowledge and our technology about how to take care of ourselves is so much different than it was then. We don't live in those days. Imperial structures were bad for people's health then. Capitalist structures are bad for people's health now. I'm not saying anything that healthcare workers don't already know, by the way. Our beloved and amazing healthcare workers work within these systems, and they understand them better than any of us do. There was a study just last month, actually just in February, and this study was done by United Healthcare, so it just consider the source. There's clearly a bias. It's not an unbiased study. But what United Healthcare does every year is they study their claims, and then they report out about changes in claims that are made. And this year, healthcare claims made by young adults are increasing faster than any other age group. They also show that young adults, this is Gen Z and millennials, are developing chronic conditions earlier than any previous generation did. The sideline of that is young adults are engaging with primary care physicians less and less than any other generation ever did, going instead to emergency rooms and urgent cares to take care of what's going on. This study also found that across the generations, there are more major health events, so heart attack, stroke, major surgeries. Major health events are twice as common than they were just 5 years ago. There's 8.6% of Americans who don't have of Americans who do not have health insurance right now. That's almost 30 million people. There are almost 30 million of our neighbors who do not have health insurance, and all predictions are that that number will increase because now we have eliminated subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, and we've also cut Medicaid programs left and right. And those cuts, my friends, they will impact all of us, insured or not. This was something I learned this week that astonished me more than anything else. Of the uninsured among us, 62% of them have made a choice to trade one daily living expense, at least one daily living expense, so that they can afford health care. So what that means is 62% of the uninsured have skipped meals so they can pay for health care, have cut back on utilities so that they can pay for health care, or even tried to stretch an existing prescription by cutting pills in half or watering it down so they can stretch it out. The fact that I'm seeing my nurses in the room nod most vigorously says something here. I feel like the truth is that we still live in a system whose structures and practices are not very good for our health. It's very expensive to be healthy in America. It is very expensive to be healthy in America. I bet you everyone in this room has had some encounter with an insurance company who has said, well, no, you actually don't need that. And if you haven't had an insurance company tell you you don't need that procedure, then you know someone who has. We can't actually pay for that one. You don't actually need that medication. This is the one that we'll pay for. When the healthcare system as a whole is as enmeshed as ours is in capitalist structures, then the point of the system is not making people healthy. It's making money. And you can't make money from healthy people. To make money, a healthcare system needs people to be sick. And this is what I mean when I say that maybe we live in a system whose structures and practices are pretty bad for our health. And maybe we need a counter narrative right about now. The good news is that there's an alternative story. There's a true story. This is a story that we know as the gospel. It is a life-giving story. It is a story of abundant life given and shared to any and all of creation. Whatever else those healing miracles mean on a theological level, they reveal this truth about the Christian story. That is, it is a life-giving story. It is a restorative story. It is a salvific story. It is a story that brings health in stark contrast to the dominant stories these days, stories of violence and isolation and illness. The Jesus story is one of healing and restoration and wholeness. So yeah, this week has been kind of hard for me to get through. And next week, maybe also. It may be easier. We'll have to wait and see. But whatever kind of week it is, I will get through it. You will get through it. We will get through it because we know the story, the real story, the counter-narrative to the dominant story, the story of Jesus, which is a story of life, and love, and peace, and grace. May we live in to that story every single day. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.